She walked into the hospital believing she would be safe, cared for, and respected. Instead, within moments, her joy turned into humiliation. A doctor someone sworn to heal Ko's cruelty over compassion, mocking her at her most vulnerable moment. The room that should have brought life was filled instead with prejudice and shame. But what neither she nor that doctor knew was that a single choice, made just minutes later, would change everything. How could one act of love and defiance turn humiliation into justice? It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of her life. Maya, a young woman expecting her first child, walked into the hospital with her husband, filled with nervous excitement. She had spent months preparing, choosing tiny clothes, decorating the nursery, and dreaming about the moment she would finally hold her baby. The hospital lights felt harsh, but she told herself it didn't matter. This was the place where her child's journey would begin. Her husband, David, carried their bag and tried to ease her nerves with quiet reassurances. They had talked endlessly about this day, how everything would go smoothly, how the staff would guide them, how Maya would be cared for with compassion. After all, a hospital was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where life was protected. But even as they checked in, there were subtle signs that something was wrong. The receptionist's forced smile, the quick glances exchanged between nurses, the way voices hushed when Maya walked by. Small, uneasy details, easily dismissed in the moment, but heavy enough to leave a trace of doubt. Maya brushed it off, reminding herself to stay focused on the joy ahead. But deep down, an unease began to grow, one she couldn't quite explain. She didn't know that behind those sterile white walls, prejudice waited. She didn't know that instead of being met with care, she would soon face humiliation from the very person entrusted with her safety. What began as hope was about to be shattered. Maya tried to steady her breathing as the contractions grew stronger. She clutched David's hand, reminding herself that she was in the right place, surrounded by professionals. But the illusion of safety shattered the moment the doctor entered the room. His presence was cold, his eyes sharp not with concern, but with something harsher. Without even greeting her, he looked at Maya as though she were a burden, an inconvenience. The first words he spoke were not words of reassurance, but of condescension. He questioned her weight, her appearance, and whether she had taken care of herself during pregnancy. Each statement cut deeper, delivered with a smirk that carried judgment rather than care. Nurses exchanged awkward glances but said nothing, their silence adding to the weight pressing down on Maya's chest. Every time she tried to ask a question, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, speaking over her as though her voice didn't matter. David's jaw tightened as he watched, but he tried to remain calm, reminding himself that this was about Maya's safety, yet inside he was boiling. How could a man entrusted with life treat someone with such disdain? The tension only grew. When Maya asked about her pain, the doctor brushed it off, telling her that women like her always exaggerated. His tone was sharp, almost mocking, as if her suffering were nothing more than a performance. With each word, Maya felt smaller, more invisible. She had come to this place vulnerable, trusting, and now that trust was being used against her. The room felt colder. Every beep of the monitor echoed like a countdown, each contraction a reminder of the cruelty she had to endure while bringing her child into the world. David squeezed her hand tighter, trying to anchor her in love. But he, too, was trapped in the helplessness of the moment. If he spoke out, would they refuse to treat her? If he stayed silent, how much more humiliation would she have to bear? The doctor's comments became sharper, slipping from insults into outright prejudice. He questioned her background, implied she wouldn't be able to care for her child properly, and even mocked her husband under his breath. It was no longer about medicine, it was about power. And in that sterile room, Maya felt stripped of her dignity. Minutes dragged on like hours, the weight of injustice pressing heavier with each passing second. Nurses shuffled in and out, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to intervene. Maya's heartbeat quickened, not just from the contractions, but from the suffocating reality that she was not seen as a patient or even as a person. David leaned closer, whispering quiet reassurances, trying to shield her with his presence. But even his strength seemed fragile against the cruelty unfolding before them. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her spirit trembled under the weight of humiliation. And then, the doctor made a remark so cruel, so cutting, that even the nurses gasped. In that moment, David knew something had to change. He couldn't stand by any longer. The question was how. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken fear. Maya's contractions grew sharper, her cries echoing against the sterile walls. But the doctor only scoffed, shaking his head as if her pain were an inconvenience. His words, laced with cruelty, struck harder than the contractions themselves. "People like you always make things more difficult," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Maya's eyes welled with tears, not just from pain, but from humiliation. She wasn't just fighting for her child anymore, she was fighting against the crushing weight of prejudice in the very moment she needed compassion the most. David's chest tightened as rage burned inside him. He had held his tongue for as long as he could, swallowing insult after insult, trying to protect Maya from any additional stress. But when the doctor leaned over her, dismissing her suffering with a smirk, something inside David snapped. He stood, taller, his voice steady but trembling with restrained fury. "Enough!" The single word cut through the room like a blade. For the first time, the doctor faltered, surprised by the sudden defiance. The monitors beeped faster. Maya's condition growing urgent, but David refused to back down. He demanded respect, demanded accountability, demanded that the man who had belittled his wife remember the oath he had sworn. Nurses froze, glancing at one another, caught between their silence and the truth that could no longer be ignored. Every second felt like an eternity. Maya gasping for breath, David refusing to step aside, the doctor's arrogance colliding with the raw power of love and defiance. And in that moment, the balance shifted. David wasn't just standing up for Maya, he was standing up against every cruel word, every silent prejudice, every injustice disguised as professionalism. The room had changed. The doctor was no longer in control, but what David did next would determine whether this story ended in despair or injustice. The silence that followed David's defiance was deafening. For the first time, the doctor stepped back, his arrogance cracking under the weight of accountability. The nurses, no longer able to ignore the truth, rallied around Maya, offering the care she had been denied. With every supportive gesture, Maya felt a piece of her dignity return. She was no longer just a patient suffering in silence. She was a mother, a woman whose voice had finally been defended. The birth of her child became more than just the beginning of a new life. It was a moment of resilience, a testament that even in the face of prejudice, love and courage could cut through cruelty. Maya held her baby close, tears streaming down her face, not just from exhaustion, but from the knowledge that she had survived more than labor. She had survived hate. David's stand that day didn't just protect his wife. It forced everyone in that room to confront the ugliness they had allowed to grow unchecked. The doctor's words could not be undone, but his power over them had been broken. And yet, as they left the hospital, a heavier truth remained. This wasn't just their story. Maya's humiliation was not an isolated event. Across the world, women of color continue to face higher risks, unequal treatment, and silent prejudice in spaces meant to heal. Her story is a reminder that racism does not always roar it off in whispers, in places where people expect safety. The question is not just how Maya endured it, but how many more will have to. So when injustice hides behind authority, who will stand and say, enough? Because silence, too, has consequences.